Welcome to the Victims and Villains podcast, a podcast extension of the nonprofit that dares to educate and engage individuals on mental health awareness through pop culture. My name is Captain Nostalgia, and on this episode, we are going to be taking a look at 3 brand new releases, all spoiler-free, where you guys can find them if you guys are interested in checking this out. And typically, these are the types of reviews that we leave for our YouTube channel, which you can find at youtube.com/victims and villains. Unfortunately, though, just October is just a insanely crazy busy month for us, and also working on the film festival and the sponsorship packets, which you guys can find out more information about at victimsandvillains.net/horrific hope. We've just found ourselves really busy this month, and to make sure that we are still talking about horror and that we are still recommending you guys movies, this is our original foundation for how we got started. So it seems only fitting that we are taking it back to where this all started, podcasting. Not that we've gotten away from podcasting, but just traditional movie reviews. We tend to stick elsewhere. So on this episode, we're going to be talking about 3 movies. We're going to be talking about They Crawl Beneath, which you can check out a interview with the director and one of the stars of the film over on our YouTube channel. We're going to be talking about the movie Frost, starring Vernon Wells. And lastly, we're also going to be talking about Spirit Halloween, the movie starring Christopher Lloyd and Rachel Lee Cook. So let's jump into They Crawl Beneath first. They Crawl Beneath is a creature feature horror drama that tells the story of a police officer recovering from a traumatic event and essentially getting trapped underneath a car and fighting off a giant worm. So when we're talking about They Crawl Beneath, the thing that I am going to say that this is going to satisfy creature feature fans. If you grew up on movies like The Blob and Tremors and Slither, this is a movie for you. I think this is going to satisfy a lot of those people that grew up on those movies, are passionate about those movies. My big thing with this from a storytelling perspective is that this movie just seems a little bit busy at times. While I think the character design and the action and the horror, the actual horror of the creatures will satisfy fans, I think it will alienate a lot of people that might not necessarily be fans of that genre, because at the core of this narrative, we follow Danny and his fiancée, Gwen, who are played by actors Joseph Almani and Carly Elridge, and 2 of these actors both give great performances in this movie. I think it's really what helps drive this is the emotional core of this film. However, because of the emotional core and because of the creature feature elements, they can sometimes clash, where if you're expecting to have basically this movie be Danny versus giant worms, then you're going to be sadly mistaken. I think this movie works on certain levels when a lot of that tension from the relationship in the third act are met with the creature feature elements. I think it works really well, but when they are established on their own, it just doesn't work. I think this movie does mental health really well, talking about how a trauma episode like what Danny experiences and kind of the after results of how it affects his relationship with Gwen and ultimately also his uncle Bill as well, I think is a fascinating exploration of the character. But let me just also begin by saying I love that this movie goes back to practical effects. Partially why this film feels like a period piece is because it uses those practical effects, and it uses them really well. They are used sparingly, but they are used enough to really make an impact. And the fact that this movie is where these creatures loom in darker lit sequences, it makes it more effective to be really creepy and effective as well. I think that the design of these characters are just really well placed, and also just feels like it feels like a throwback. It feels nostalgic, and it really does work. The pacing in this movie can sometimes feel all over the place, and I say that because, again, I came into this movie expecting a little bit of a creature feature. I was surprised by how the film uses drama, but that drama that pushes the story forward also holds it back. A lot of the things that make this film interesting, unfortunately, the pacing for this movie is all over the place. And what I mean by that is the parts where we are invested into the horror aspects of this, whether it is someone being bitten or facing off against one of the creatures, the movie feels really fast, but the film really seems to slow down as it's kind of exploring these character moments and their history between Danny and Gwen, and that kind of just makes for some really uneven pacing. And as a result, the film feels like it never reaches its true potential, because we're made to care about this protagonist in Danny, but the film ultimately falls short because of just how busy this film feels. And probably one of the things that really irritate me most about this movie is how the film ends. I'm not going to spoil it, but the film kind of just jumps into probably one of the most cliched endings that we see in horror, and it just feels kind of out of tone with the rest of the film and how the film weaves in tension from both the relationship aspect but also the creature feature aspect. And I think that tension's woven really well, and how everything is kind of tied up in the end, it just feels like that tension was really wasted. So I'm going to go ahead and give They Crawl Beneath a 2.5 out of 5. I don't want to talk about mental health with this movie. We talked about it with the film's actor, Michael Pierre, and also Dale Fabregat, the film's director. Over on YouTube, we really jumped into the mental health of these characters and the mental health of a process of creating this. I found I had a new appreciation for this movie after sitting down and talking with them, but the film's elements of its narrative and drama and just the pacing still kind of all over the place. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and give this one a 2.5 out of 5. You guys can pick up this movie now. It is now available on Blu-ray, DVD, and digital, wherever you guys get your movies from Wellgo Entertainment. Next, we have Frost, which is going to be available on Blu-ray, DVD, and digital from Cleopatra Entertainment beginning October 11th. This movie tells the story of a pregnant woman who reconnects with her estranged father, only to find themselves victim to the elements when their car breaks down in the middle of an ice storm. And yeah, so let me just start off by saying this movie, if you're coming into this movie expecting a horror film, something thriller, a psychological aspect, this movie will let you down. I just want to start off by saying that this is not what I would classify as a horror movie. I think this movie works better as a drama, and the performances actually back that up. I'll talk about the performances in just a few seconds, but this movie works really well as a drama, but not necessarily as a horror film. Now, with that said, the third act of this movie does weave in tension and suspense really well, and actually has a really just kind of grotesque ending, but it fits in line with the world that this movie creates, and I wanted more of that grotesque imagery. I really wish it would have come a little bit earlier in there, but director Brandon Sagal does a really good job at weaving those elements in there. And Yeah, so let's talk about this movie, because this movie, it feels like a film we've seen 100 times before. Car breaks down, you are now victim to the elements, and you are essentially having to face off and against wildlife, against the elements, against Mother Nature. And this movies like that are kind of done in that capacity. We've seen them done hundreds of times, whether you're talking about movies like The Perfect Storm. I would even dare to say Jeepers Creepers 2 it would be put in that category. But those movies, I feel like, work really well and probably work a little bit better than what Sagel and team create here. This movie does atmosphere really well. I feel like the way that certain shots are set up with Sagel's eye for tension and suspension works really well for this film. I feel like the cinematography adds to that. The film feels really cold. It really adds in a lot of that atmospheric horror that you are coming to expect. My biggest problem with this movie is probably just how slow it feels. The point in the movie where our two actors, the father and daughter, who are played by Vernon Wells and Devani Penn, who both give really, really awesome performances in this movie. I feel like this movie actually would have felt so much more painful to work through had it not been for these two performances. They really anchor the film and bring it into new territory. We spend most of our time with Penn as the main protagonist and kind of the source of screen time, and her emotional range in this movie is absolutely exceptional. I think she is one of the best. She's giving it her all. And this is one of those movies that is a great example of a really just elevated performance in a bad movie, and how that performance essentially elevates the rest of the movie. I think her performance in this not only elevates the tension of the situations that her character is going through, the suspense of will she make it out alive, is Vernon Wells' daddy coming back, because Vernon Wells' character essentially leaves to go get help. And so they're kind of separated for the majority of the film, and so you have that, and then you also have, at the same time, you have this situation that Penn finds herself in, where she's even questioning whether or not she's going to live to find tomorrow. Not only that, but also the possibility of fighting off larger carnivores within this forest of which they have broken down. And this movie just does a lot of really good things with its atmosphere, and I feel like it works as an atmospheric horror, but this movie operates and it feels too much like a drama to really be anything else. Again, this movie is kind of really sluggish, and I am gonna, pun intended, say that this movie feels frostbitten, and on our Rorschach rating scale, this one's gonna get a 2 out of 5. This movie is really straightforward, but there are other movies that have done this concept way better. So you guys can check it out for yourself when it comes out on October 11th. Let's talk about the mental health of this movie, though. I talked about this recently in another movie, and I think sometimes we as a society, we feel obligated to be invested in family, and despite what it might do to our own mental health in the process. And what I liked about this movie is the fact that this is a father and daughter becoming reacquainted. And you can kind of see early on in the first act, as they're kind of doing it, what has happened. The Vernon Wells character is an alcoholic, and they kind of explore like why he's an alcoholic, and that's really fascinating. But Penn's character is actually in the past has kind of been kind of portrayed as a little bit of like a wild child, and you can kind of see how these two worlds clash, but Penn essentially is like really reluctant on kind of reconnecting. And I love the fact that they're exploring this less than ideal character, because it opens up the conversation to say that protect your own mental health at all cost. If that means that you have to separate yourself from toxic family or toxic environments, whether that be employment, friends, significant others, even school, take your mental health seriously. And I love that this film is kind of showing what the road on the other side looks like, to where Penn's character is now mature. She's expecting her first child, and she's wanting to essentially reconnect with her father in the terms of, because she herself is in a better mental health space. And sometimes that's what it takes. Is it takes the separation of being away from somebody, the source of toxicity, to work on our own selves and kind of reassess or to reanalyze the situation and say, if I invite this person back into my life, what's it going to do to my own mental health? Or how long do I need to assess whether or not I need to write these people out of my life? Do I need to write these people out of my life? And just the questions like this, and just kind of exploring your own mental health and really what makes you fascinating, what makes you healthy when it comes to your mental health. And so, yeah, that's really what I just want to encourage you. I think this film does a really good job at kind of showing the struggles and the messiness that comes with family and how that affects your mental health. And I think that's something we as a society, we don't really ever think about, or we ever talk about, is because there's, I think, that sitcom mentality of you have to, be respectful to your parents and things along those lines, and how long do you have to put up with that if there's a toxicity, or there's a harmful effect to your own mental health, or your own how you self-care or self-love, or just a number of other things. So take your mental health seriously, and if that means you have to work on it and cut people out of your life, start making those steps. And because that they're out of your life now doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to be out of your life for eternity. And this movie proves that. So Frost comes out on October 11th to Blu-ray, DVD, and VOD from Cleopatra Entertainment. And our last film that we're going to be talking about today is a film that actually just had a short theatrical run. I'm sure that we're going to be getting a video release for it soon. But that is the family horror comedy Spirit Halloween, the movie. This movie tells the story of 3 teenagers who are kind of quote-unquote too old to go trick-or-treating. And so as a result, they find themselves locked in a Spirit Halloween and facing off against a old local legend that proves to be true, that possesses a whole bunch of Spirit Halloween animatronics. And they have to survive to the night and essentially beat the demon. What I loved about this movie is just how fun this movie is. This movie has a real innocence about it that I feel like feels really, I don't want to say outdated, but it feels nostalgic. This movie to me feels like it could have come out in the 80s. When you look at like a lot of 80s movies, and we talked about this recently in our episode on The Gate, but you kind of get parents out of the equation and then kids kind of rule the day. And that's what this movie does. Now, granted, there are still parental figures that take place within this universe, but for the large part, we follow these kids and kind of them going up against this army, so to say, of haunted Halloween dolls. And this movie just has a real innocence about it. Like I said, it's oddly wholesome, and it's a great modern day gateway horror piece.
I found myself laughing several times throughout the course of this movie. To make no mistakes, the writing is really cheesy. It's probably one of the weakest horror scripts that we've gotten this year. But again, I am over 30 and I'm reviewing a movie that is made for probably those that are 15 and under. But growing up on movies like, IPs like Goosebumps and Are You Afraid of the Dark, and just movies like that, and books and TV shows, like, gateway horror has always meant a lot to me, and I feel like this movie does a good job at kind of serving as a good gateway horror for modern day audiences. It feels like it was made for Disney Channel. The production quality might be maybe 5% better than what you see on Disney Channel. The acting is very reminiscent of gateway horror movies that Disney Channel produced in the 90s, whether you're talking about Under Wraps, Phantom of the Megaplex, Halloween Town. This movie has a lot of that charm and spirit and notoriously bad acting. The acting in this movie is... So the film's leads in this are a trio of young, up-and-coming actors played by Donovan Collin, who plays Jake, our main protagonist. Carson Dill is played by Dylan Martin Fagel, and Bo is played by Jaden S. Smith. And then, of course, we also get the babysitter archetype that is played Kate in this movie, as played by Marissa Reyes. And the acting in this is, I wouldn't come in for high quality. Again, it feels like a Disney Channel original movie, something that would have played, but it has a lot of that charm that also exists with that. And so you have kind of the over-the-top bad guy that's played in this one wonderfully by Christopher Lloyd, and just kind of getting to see him play a menace. Like, he's not in this movie for a super long time. He's mostly his voice, but he just has a really over-the-top campiness that I really, really responded to in this movie. I think he might be the best part. Rachel Lee Cook is also in this movie, and she does such a great job as well. And this movie, overall, it's paced fairly well. This movie clocks in at 81 minutes, and it uses its time really efficiently. It never once drags. There's always something kind of going on in the film, and I had a lot of fun with this movie. This movie is probably not going to be anything groundbreaking for in terms of cinema or in conversation, but I think it's well worth a watch, and it's a lot of fun. The animatronics actually look really great. I was expecting kind of lower quality costume design, and it really surprised me. The character design and how well everything looks in terms of CGI / practical effects, and the marriage that exists there is also looks just really dazzling, and it looks surprisingly good for how low I imagine this budget is. And then on top of that, this movie, just completely talking aside from the quality of this movie, this is genius on the part of Spirit Halloween. It's basically an hour and 20-minute commercial for the company, and they made what could have just felt like really forced marketing and advertising for the company. Actually ends up being a really rather enduring fun time. And when I say enduring, this film actually, Colin, who plays our protagonist Jake in this movie, recently has lost his father, and some of his friends kind of don't want to really share in tradition anymore. So there's a lot of things kind of conflicting, and I think the way that this movie explores change and the subjects of grief are also really, really well done in this movie, and that's kind of what really elevates it from being just another throwaway gateway horror film and into actually being perhaps one of the funnest and surprisingly deep movies that we've got this year. There's a couple sequences in the third act that really, really warmed my heart in terms of it's just terms of character development, but also at the same time, like feeling the emotions that these characters feel. So I am going to give this movie a 3 out of 5. This movie is only playing in limited release right now, and I have no idea when it actually hits Blu-ray, DVD, or streaming, so keep an eye out for it. I would imagine publications like Bloody Disgusting or Dread Central would tweet it out when that is coming. But talking about mental health in this movie again talks and addresses grief. It addresses grief in a really, really special way, because I feel like up to this point, we've gotten stories that have explored losing a parent or losing a loved one. And typically when these stories are being explored, these are being explored from the POV of someone that is over the age of 20. You know, we're not really exploring a lot of younger. And Jake, our protagonist in this, is probably 12. And getting to just kind of see how he deals with grief. I think this is a really honest exploration of how kids process grief, and also the conversation opens up on how we address the subject of grief with kids, and specifically how that grief brings upon change, and how sometimes change can affect our mental health, can affect our relationships, can affect even really how we operate in our day-to-day lives. And I feel like this film does a spectacular job at addressing that. And I just want to speak out to anyone listening to this right now. I don't know who, if you're a parent or something like this, but death is one of the hardest subjects I would imagine to talk about with your kids. And this is coming from someone that does not have kids. I can't speak to the hardships of of those kinds of conversations, but I think it's a beautiful thing to be open with your kids about the afterlife, and to learn about what happens as far as death goes, and what happens after someone dies, and how that affects the family dynamic. I lost my grandmother when I was 10, and it was the first time that I felt depression, and it was something that not only bonded my mother and I closer, and but also at the same time, it also opened up conversations to talk about the five stages of grief. You know, whether you're talking about it, going through anger or denial, or finally acceptance. And I think this movie does a really good job at that. So I don't know who needs to hear this, but yes, there will be sadness that comes, but just an encouragement to talk to your kids about the 5 stages of grief and the mental health that comes with each of those 5 steps. So yeah, I don't know. This movie does it a lot better than I can speak to, because again, I'm not a parent, and I don't really spend a whole lot of time with kids. So this is just kind of me. Yeah, just go watch the movie. The movie does it a lot better, but as always, if you or someone you know is listening to this and you're struggling with suicide, addiction, self-harm, or depression, links are going to be in the descriptions below, where you guys can check out our mental health resource library. And just once again, make sure that you guys check out They Crawl Beneath, now available on Blu-ray, DVD, VOD from Wellgo Entertainment. Frost, which is going to be hitting shelves and digital platforms beginning October 11th from Cleopatra Entertainment. And on top of that, also keep your eye out on this for Spirit Halloween. The movie is now playing in limited release and will be available on VOD and streaming platforms soon. Thank you guys for listening, and make sure that you guys subscribe to us on YouTube. We have a lot of cool things that we're always doing, and subscribe to us wherever you guys get your podcasts from, and thank you for listening. Have a good night, guys.